Welcome to Unholy Inquiry, where each tale leads you deeper into a labyrinth of mystery waiting to be uncovered. This time, join us as we delve into Miss Marple and the Last Dinner's Twist, a fan-crafted story that pays homage to the genius and sophistication of Agatha Christie's iconic detective, Miss Marple. We are thrilled to have you with us on this captivating journey. Share your thoughts, let us know where you're tuning in from, and if you spot any details we missed, your feedback is invaluable. Together, let's continue to shape even more thrilling enigmas. Chapter 1. The Final Toast Was Never Drunk. The storm rolled in just after dusk, sweeping over the thatched rooftops of Nether Kiddington with a theatrical rumble, as though the heavens themselves were setting the stage. Rain lashed at the windows of Greystone Manor, blurring the view of the hedgerows and distant lane, and inside, the drawing-room glowed with amber light, a contrast to the bleakness outside. The fire snapped and hissed, throwing shadows across the velvet curtains and polished parquet floor, while a half-dozen voices rose in low, genteel conversation over the clink of crystal and the soft clatter of silver. Miss Marple sat quietly in a floral armchair, her knitting needles momentarily stilled on her lap. She had been invited as something of a sentimental gesture by Lady Fawley, who admired Miss Marple's reputation for gentle wisdom and discretion. She had not expected much more than pleasant conversation and a pudding made with too much nutmeg. What she had not expected, what none of them had expected, was that the evening would end with death. The final course had been served, raspberry trifle with almond biscuits, followed by an offer of brandy and coffee, which the butler, Mr. Gowans, dutifully began to pour. The hostess, Lady Fawley, elegant in her pearls and with her grey hair swept up, raised her glass toward the end of the long oak table. "To our charming company," she said with a crisp smile, "and to Colonel Luscombe, for whom no dinner party is ever complete without a tale of scandal and a questionable punchline." A ripple of polite laughter passed around the table as Colonel Luscombe, rotund and red-cheeked, waved a hand modestly. But before the glasses could rise in unison, a sharp gasp drew every eye to the far end of the table. Mr. Harold Beckett, a solicitor from Oxford, and a man of precise manner and prickly wit, had frozen in place. His fork clattered to the plate. His lips parted as though a question had caught mid-flight. Then, in a sudden horrifying collapse, he slumped forward into the remnants of his trifle. Gasps turned to cries, chairs scraped as several guests leapt to their feet. Lady Fawley shrieked. Colonel Luscombe cursed and attempted to lift Beckett upright, but Miss Marple did not move. She watched, eyes narrowing behind her spectacles. The doctor was summoned at once, of course. Dr. Percival from the village arrived in his greatcoat, trailing rein and urgency, and examined Beckett while the others murmured in the drawing-room. 10 minutes later, he emerged, face pale, spectacles fogged. "He's dead," he announced, tugging off his gloves. "Heart, it seems, but I should be cautious to say anything conclusive just yet." "But he was perfectly well," Lady Fawley protested. "He even declined the soup because he said it was too rich." "It wasn't the food," muttered Colonel Luscombe. "It was the brandy, surely. Gowans, where's that decanter?" They all returned to the table, sombre and puzzled, while Mr. Gowans brought the heavy crystal decanter forward. It was full. Not a single glass had been sipped. Miss Marple leaned closer. "He didn't drink it," she said quietly. "No," Lady Fawley replied. "None of us had. He collapsed just before the toast. He never touched his glass." "Which means," Miss Marple murmured, more to herself than the room, "that if it was poison, it wasn't in the brandy." The word poison cast a hush, like a veil falling over the party. It had not been uttered before. Inspector Dover from Market Cleeve arrived an hour later, his boots dripping mud onto the black and white tiled floor of the foyer. He was a sensible man, not prone to theatrics, and treated Miss Marple with the distant politeness afforded to old women with too much time on their hands. "No signs of forced entry," he said after a brief sweep. "Nothing disturbed. Staff are all accounted for. And the food was prepared by the cook, Mrs. Grimsby, who's worked for the family 23 years. But Harold Beckett was not a frequent guest," Miss Marple said softly. The inspector frowned. "You knew him well." "Only by reputation," she replied. "He was involved in a recent will dispute in the village. An unpleasant affair. Very exacting in court, I hear." "Any enemies?" "I expect he had dozens," she said. "But who among them was invited to dinner tonight?" The inspector gave her a sidelong glance. "You think the death was deliberate?" "I think Mr. Beckett was not the sort to fall face first into a dessert without cause." The body was removed shortly after midnight. Guests were encouraged to remain at Greystone for the night due to the weather and the lateness of the hour. Tension lingered like cigar smoke in the halls, and doors were locked with more attention than usual. The manor, despite its grandeur, had never felt so claustrophobic. Miss Marple, unable to sleep, wandered the hallway with slow, purposeful steps. She paused at the library where the Colonel stood nursing a whiskey by the fire. "You didn't like Beckett," she said, startling him. "Didn't like?" Luscombe grunted. "Damned snake in a cravat. Tried to blacken my nephew's name over a property line. And yet you toasted him." "Social niceties," he said gruffly. Miss Marple gave a faint smile. "Yes. But I noticed you were the only one who didn't reach for your brandy glass when Lady Fawley proposed the toast. Why is that?" He looked at her sharply. "I'd already had mine." But that glass remained untouched. A pause, then a chuckle. "All right, Miss Marple. You caught me. I wasn't about to toast the man. But I assure you I wouldn't kill him for being an ass." "No," she agreed. "Not for that." Outside, the rain slowed to a whisper. A clock somewhere chimed 2. Back in her room, Miss Marple sat on the edge of her bed, thinking. She replayed the dinner in her mind. The way Mr. Beckett had held his fork delicately, eating sparingly. The way he had touched his lips with a napkin, the odd flicker of discomfort just before he collapsed. It wasn't the wine, nor the trifle, nor the brandy, but something had entered his system. The next morning, the police returned with a report. No signs of poison in the brandy or food, yet Dr. Percival, cautious as ever, had noted redness in the eyes and an odd smell on the body. Almonds, perhaps? Miss Marple blinked. Cyanide? If so, it acted quickly. But where had it come from? She asked to see the place settings. The plates had been cleared, but the silver remained in the scullery, neatly stacked. She requested Beckett's knife and fork. Mr. Gowans brought them forward, frowning. They were wiped, I believe. But here they are. She held the fork up to the light. Nothing visible. Then she examined the underside of the handle, and there it was. A faint discoloration. The tiniest smear of something whitish, crusted like old salt. "Inspector," she said as Dover entered the kitchen behind her. "I should like the cutlery tested. This fork in particular." He looked at her askance. "You think the fork was poisoned?" "Not the food, the utensil," she said. "It would explain the symptoms, the timing. A thin coating of cyanide compound, applied with care, only to the handle. When he brought the fork to his lips." "By God," muttered Dover, "no one would suspect the fork." "No one except the person who brought it to the table," she said softly. The butler stiffened. "I lay no blame yet, Mr. Gowans," she said kindly. "But tell me, were the place settings changed after you laid them this afternoon?" "Only one," he said, glancing uneasily at the inspector. "Lady Fawley asked me to adjust Mr. Beckett's. She said the silver didn't match." "She asked that specifically?" Miss Marple asked. He nodded. Miss Marple turned to the inspector. Then perhaps Lady Fawley might be willing to clarify that change, especially as the fork in question did, indeed, match. The inspector's brows drew low. Why would she switch the silver? Indeed, Miss Marple murmured, her voice low. Unless she wanted to ensure Mr. Beckett received a particular fork. A moment later, a maid entered, breathless. Sir, Miss Marple, Lady Fawley is gone. Gone? The inspector echoed. What do you mean, gone? Her room is empty, the girl whispered. Window open, luggage missing. Miss Marple stood very still. Then I suggest, Inspector, that we look not for who had cause to kill Harold Beckett, but for who had cause to fear him. She turned back toward the scullery window, where the glass was misted from the cold. There, faint but visible, were marks, fingerprints, along the edge of the sill. And on the window-sill itself, resting in the rain-soaked leaves of the creeping ivy, was a calling card. Miss Marple reached out, gently lifted it. The ink had blurred, but the name was still legible beneath the droplet stains. Charlotte Fawley, widow of Sir Ambrose Fawley, and, scrawled beneath it, in a shakier hand, he knew. I had no choice. Miss Marple exhaled slowly. Somewhere in the back of her mind, the final toast still echoed, never drunk, but deadly all the same. And the real story, she suspected, was only just beginning. Chapter 2. The Chair That Should Have Been Empty. The storm had not passed. If anything, it had grown meaner overnight, pounding the slate roof of Greystone Manor with the furious persistence of something that refused to be forgotten. Miss Marple stood by the narrow corridor window just after dawn, watching the trees bend and sway in the wind like dancers with broken rhythm. A servant's lantern flickered in the courtyard below, casting long shadows that shifted with every gust. Somewhere in the east wing, a door slammed and the wind moaned through the chimney like a voice too long silenced. Sleep had come only in fragments. Too many unanswered questions clattered around her mind, questions about Mr. Beckett's sudden death, the poisoned fork, and, more troubling still, the vanished Lady Fawley. Miss Marple had learned over many years that in polite society, death was rarely the end. More often, it was a doorway. And now she was certain. Someone had crossed through before the rest of them realised it had even opened. At 7:30, Miss Marple made her way to the dining room. The scent of burnt toast and black tea lingered faintly in the air, and the fire had not yet been lit. She preferred rooms like this in the early morning, cold, quiet, when the masks had not yet been fixed in place. The long oak table was still set as it had been the night before, though slightly dishevelled. Servants had been too unnerved to clear everything properly. Silver gleamed faintly in the grey morning light, and the trifle bowls sat like little tombs, half-finished and sticky. Miss Marple walked slowly down the length of the table, pausing by each chair. There had been 8 guests total, including Lady Fawley and herself. The chairs were labelled with place cards, now slightly curled at the corners. She paused at the one marked for Mr. Beckett. The seat remained pulled back as if he'd left suddenly. The brandy glass sat untouched, a pale ghost of a ring visible on the linen. But it was the chair beside him that caught her eye. It bore the card, Doctor. Lionel Norris, written in Lady Fawley's precise hand. Miss Marple remembered that name well. She had remarked on it the evening before, surprised to see it among the guests. But the doctor had not come. He had sent word, hadn't he? Something about a delayed patient. Or was it that the message had never arrived at all? She leaned closer. The napkin on Dr. Norris's plate had been unfolded. His water glass was half empty. A smear of trifle lined the dessert spoon. Miss Marple's brow furrowed. She looked back over her memory of the night. Every chair filled, every voice accounted for. No one had arrived late. No apology had been made for a missing guest. And yet here was the setting unmistakably used. Someone had sat in Dr. Norris's place, and no one had noticed. A floorboard creaked behind her. Couldn't sleep either, Miss Marple, came a familiar voice. Colonel Luscombe entered, tying his robe with brisk efficiency. He was less red-faced now, more pale, eyes ringed with a weariness he tried to mask behind bluster. Miss Marple gestured toward the chair. "I find myself wondering, Colonel, who sat here last night?" He looked down, then frowned. "That's odd. Norris didn't come." "No," she said. "And yet someone clearly sat here, ate here, even unfolded the napkin." Luscombe stepped back, visibly perturbed. "You think someone took his place deliberately?" "I think someone occupied this seat, yes, whether by mistake or intention." "That's the question." A moment passed. He rubbed his temple. "It's blasted unnerving, that's what it is. First Beckett keels over, then Charlotte vanishes. And now this." He paused. "You don't think the two are connected?" "I think it's unwise," Miss Marple said gently, "to think of any event as isolated when they occur in the same room on the same night." By noon the inspector had returned, summoned once again by the anxious staff. He trudged into the manor, with his hat soaked through, looking thoroughly displeased to be back. Miss Marple met him in the foyer. "There's something you should see," she said, leading him directly to the dining room. She showed him the place setting, the empty glass, the smeared dessert spoon. "She's right," he muttered. "No one noticed this last night. No one remarked on it. But I believe the person who sat here did not want to be seen." "But who?" Miss Marple didn't answer directly. "Inspector, when Mr. Beckett died, everyone's attention was drawn to him, naturally. But what if someone used that moment, chaotic, unguarded, to vanish, or to change something? The cutlery, for instance." "You're thinking this mystery guest tampered with the fork?" "I'm suggesting that someone may have come, eaten quietly, made themselves appear part of the gathering, and left before the night ended." "But why?" "Perhaps to watch," she said softly. "Perhaps to act." The inspector stared at her. "It's madness. Not if you assume they were never meant to be invited." Later that afternoon, a rain-drenched telegram arrived. It was addressed to Lady Fawley and sent from a surgery in Cheltenham. Dr. Norris had been detained unexpectedly and would not be able to attend the dinner. The telegram was dated the morning before. It should have arrived by post well before the meal. "But it didn't," Miss Marple said, turning the envelope over in her hands. "Why?" They questioned Gowans. He swore no telegram had arrived. The postman was called. He said he had delivered 2 envelopes that morning, one for Lady Fawley, one for Mr. Beckett. The one for Beckett, it turned out, was missing, so 2 telegrams had been delivered. Only one had made it to the recipient. The other had vanished. Later, while the servants were occupied and the house in a subdued hush, Miss Marple made her way to the study. Lady Fawley's private papers were still neatly arranged on the writing desk, but it was the waste-paper basket that caught her attention. She lifted out a crumpled ball of paper and smoothed it carefully. There, in the faded blue ink of a telegram form, were the words, "Unable to attend. Delayed at surgery. Apologies. Dr. Norris." Miss Marple folded the telegram and handed it to the inspector when she found him. "Someone retrieved this from the mail," she said. "Someone who wanted us to believe Dr. Norris might arrive." "And then took his place." "Yes." He looked at her. "But if it wasn't Norris, who was it?" "That, I believe, is tied to Mr. Beckett's case files. He was handling an estate dispute, wasn't he? One that had recently escalated." The inspector nodded. "The Hadlow inheritance. 2 siblings. Beckett represented the sister. The brother had gone to London to dispute it." "Did either of them live nearby?" "The brother, Algernon Hadlow. He's taken rooms at the King's Arm in Lower Wickfield." "Why?" Miss Marple's eyes glinted. "Because if someone had motive to silence Mr. Beckett, and the nerve to do it, quietly they would also have known when to act. And perhaps how to disguise themselves." The inspector stared at her. "You're saying the missing guest was Algernon Hadlow in disguise? I'm saying we must confirm who received that missing telegram and who might have gained by ensuring Mr. Beckett never delivered a verdict." As the rain pounded against the windows once more, a knock came at the front door. A constable brought word from the inn. Algernon Hadlow was no longer in his rooms. He had checked out shortly after midnight. But what chilled Miss Marple most was not his departure. It was what the innkeeper had found that morning when cleaning his room. A waiter's uniform, stained with trifle. And tucked in the pocket, a small white envelope, bearing Lady Forley's seal, torn open. Miss Marple stared at the envelope as the inspector laid it on the table beside the soiled uniform. Something was not right. Lady Forley's seal, and Algernon Hadlow's escape. She stepped back and said, quietly, "Inspector, I think we've been looking for the wrong person. Algernon may be involved, but I believe he wasn't working alone. There's a third presence in this affair, and they've managed to stay invisible." She looked at the empty chair once again. Who sat in that seat may tell us who planned this all along. But we must find the one person who knows who was missing at that table, and chose not to speak. The inspector's brows furrowed. And who would that be? Miss Marple turned towards the corridor where the cook, Mrs. Grimsby, stood watching. "She laid the table," Miss Marple said quietly. "She saw who sat where, and I suspect she saw more than she's said." The wind howled, and the fire crackled low. In the silence that followed, Miss Marple's knitting slipped from her lap. She didn't notice. She was already thinking of the next question, because someone had sat where they shouldn't, and someone had lied to cover for them. Chapter 3. The letter that arrived a day too late. The morning after the storm broke, the village of Nether Kiddington lay in a sodden hush, the kind of silence that felt too heavy to last. The wind had finally worn itself out, but the aftermath remained in bent hedges, puddled stone paths, and chimney soot loosened and blown across once pristine windows. Miss Marple had taken her tea earlier than usual and sat now in the east drawing-room at Greystone Manor, fingers gently turning over the pages of a well-thumbed gardening book, though her eyes had not moved past the same paragraph for nearly half an hour. Her thoughts were with Harold Beckett, the solicitor who had died 2 nights before, and the phantom guest who had taken the chair beside him, unnoticed, and vanished just as easily. At 10:15, the butler, Mr. Gowans, shuffled in with a faint knock and a puzzled look on his face. In his hand, he held a small envelope, cream, thick, expensive-looking, and bearing the neat handwriting of the deceased solicitor. "This just arrived, miss," he said, his tone uncertain. "It was in the post this morning, addressed to Lady Forley, though she's no longer here. It appears to be from Mr. Beckett." Miss Marple looked up, her eyes narrowing slightly. "May I see it?" Mr. Gowans hesitated, then handed it over. The seal was still intact, waxed and pressed with a curious spiral insignia. Miss Marple turned it over delicately, noting the smudge of ink along the lower edge. She pressed the envelope to her nose, frowning. "It's damp," she said softly, "and the ink is fresh. This wasn't written 3 days ago." Mr. Gowans blinked. "But he died 2 nights ago." "Yes," she murmured. "Which begs the question, how did a man dead since Thursday post a letter that smells as though it was written yesterday?" He stepped back. "You think someone posted it on his behalf? Or that someone deliberately delayed its delivery?" She opened the letter carefully, peeling the wax and sliding out a single sheet of paper. The script was unmistakably Beckett's, tight, confident, lawyerly, but the contents were nothing like legal formality. It was emotional, almost raw. "To Lady Forley, you asked me to keep your secret. I told you once I would, until your conscience failed. Now I fear you've gone too far. The letter you thought destroyed, I kept. If I am silenced or disappear, someone must know. The betrayal lies within these very walls. H.B." Miss Marple read it again. Then, again, her expression unreadable. When she finally looked up, Her gaze was fixed not on Mr. Gowans but on the empty fireplace. "Mr. Gowans, may I ask, who fetched the post from the village this morning?" "The maid, Agnes, as usual." "Did she remark on anything strange? Late deliveries, for instance?" "She said it was bundled in with the others. Nothing odd, except the postman said it had been misfiled yesterday. Apparently left in the wrong satchel." "How curious." Gowans looked uncomfortable. "You think someone tampered with the mail?" "I think someone ensured this letter would not arrive in time." As Gowans left the room, Miss Marple sat still for a long moment, studying the letter. The mention of the letter you thought destroyed gnawed at her. It wasn't just a warning, it was a confession. Beckett had known something dangerous, something that had put him in the crosshairs of someone desperate, and it was connected to Lady Fawley. By midday, Inspector Dover had returned once more, now a regular fixture at the manor. He read the letter twice before swearing under his breath. "He's talking about a destroyed letter. What could that mean?" "An earlier communication," Miss Marple said. "One Lady Fawley hoped had been discarded. Beckett evidently preserved it, perhaps as protection. But whatever it was, it seems to have provoked panic." "Do you think it's connected to the Hadlow dispute?" the inspector asked. "Possibly," she said, "but I suspect this is older, more personal." They interviewed the maid, Agnes, who confirmed she had retrieved the post from the usual drop point. But she recalled something odd. When she handed the post to Mr. Gowans, he had commented that the Beckett letter looked fresh. She thought nothing of it until now. It was dry on the outside, but the ink on the back, where the sender's mark was, had run a little, as though it hadn't had time to dry before the rain got to it. Miss Marple nodded, which tells us it was not only posted after his death. It was written shortly before. And yet, where was it for the last day? The inspector's brow furrowed. Hidden? Or held, she said quietly, by someone hoping they could intercept it. Later that day, while the rain began anew in the late afternoon, Miss Marple asked to examine Beckett's luggage, which remained stored in one of the guest rooms. With the inspector's permission, she went through the contents: starched shirts, a legal pad, a half-read copy of Trollope, and at the very bottom, beneath a false bottom in the case, a folded envelope. Unlike the letter sent to Lady Fawley, this one was unsealed. Inside it was a single page, written in the same hand but more composed. Less emotion, more strategy. To whom it may concern. If this reaches you, it means I am no longer able to speak freely. There is a document, one which Lady Fawley believes destroyed. I kept it. It concerns her late husband's will. She forged a page to exclude his natural heir, and I discovered the truth. She begged me to stay quiet, but now I believe she will not stop at begging. Miss Marple let out a quiet breath. She tucked the letter back carefully and replaced the false bottom. When she left the room, the corridor felt colder. Shadows stretched longer than they should in the lamplight. By evening, she sat again with the inspector in the study. She forged a page of the will, he said slowly. That changes everything. If Beckett had proof of this, and she believed it was gone, she might have found herself with little choice, Miss Marple said gently. You think she poisoned him? I think she had the motive, but motive does not equal guilt. Not yet. A knock came at the study door. It was Agnes, pale-faced and hesitant. I thought you should see this, she said, holding out a small silver box. It was in the linen cupboard, tucked behind the pillowcases. Inside was a folded piece of stationery, not Beckett's, but from Greystone Manor's own embossed supply. The C. Handwriting was a woman's, elegant, looping, familiar. Lady Fawley. To the one who finds this, I did not kill him, I swear it, but I lied. I lied to save my name, my son's inheritance, and my husband's legacy. The truth is in the greenhouse. Charlotte. The inspector stared at the note. Greenhouse. Miss Marple rose at once. Come. Bring a torch. The greenhouse at Greystone stood like a forgotten cathedral on the western edge of the estate, half swallowed by ivy and shadow. Its glass panes were clouded with grime, and the door creaked like a protest as it opened. They stepped inside, the air heavy with damp soil and the faint perfume of decaying blooms. Miss Marple moved between the rusted tables and overturned pots with an eerie certainty. She paused by the back wall where a stack of broken crates had been pushed into a corner. She knelt, brushing aside old earth. There, half buried beneath a tile, was a long tin box. Inside was the missing page of Sir Ambrose Forley's will. Bore the same spiral insignia seen on the wax seal of Becket's letter, his discreet mark. The clause reinstated a name crossed out in the publicly declared version. Edward Ambrose Forley, acknowledged natural heir. Her husband had a son, the inspector muttered. Illegitimate, perhaps, but named nonetheless. And she erased him from the inheritance. Miss Marple nodded, quiet, and Becket knew. They returned to the manor in silence, the tin box wrapped in oilcloth. In the drawing room, the fire was roaring again, but the warmth felt hollow. So, Lady Forley fled because she feared exposure, the inspector said. But did she kill to prevent it? Miss Marple didn't answer right away. She was desperate, that much is clear. But I still think there's another hand in this. Someone else who knew. Someone who had access to the house. And something to lose if the truth came out. She reached for the sealed envelope once more and held it to the firelight. Then her eyes widened. "Inspector," she said quietly. "Do you see this?" He leaned closer. The return address Becket had written was wrong. Instead of Oxford, it listed a house in Lower Wickfield. "A staging address," Miss Marple whispered. He wanted the letter intercepted. Or he knew someone might try. She turned the envelope in her hand again, then froze. The seal, not wax, but soap wax, cracked differently, and there, a faint tear where it had been opened and clumsily resealed. "The letter was tampered with," she said. "Someone read it, then sealed it again and made it look delayed." The inspector stood up at once. "Then they're still here." Miss Marple looked toward the shadows in the hall. "They are, and now they know we're watching." Outside, the wind had picked up again. But it wasn't the weather that made her shiver. It was the creeping sense that someone in Greystone Manor had already planned their next move. And the next death. Do you like this personality? Chapter 4. The housemaid heard more than she said. It was just after twilight, and Greystone Manor once again wore its shroud of mist and suspicion. The storm had lessened, but not entirely. The rain now whispered against the windows like breath on glass, while the garden paths glistened in the fading light. Indoors, the air remained charged, as if the walls themselves were listening. Fire crackled in the hearths, and candles flickered more nervously than usual. Someone, had shaken the order of things, and the manor, like its occupants, could feel it. Miss Marple was seated in the morning room, a space now used less for tea and more for quiet observations. The latest developments weighed heavily. Becket's secret will page recovered from the greenhouse, Lady Forley's flight, and a letter that had been opened before it reached its recipient. Nothing quite aligned. She knew from experience that truth rarely presented itself in full. It arrived in fragments, whispers, the careless turn of a word, or in this case, the frightened hesitation of a housemaid. Agnes Green was no more than 17, pale as milk, with large, anxious eyes and an unfortunate tendency to wring her hands when nervous, which was always. She had been with the household less than 6 months, taken on by Lady Forley when the last maid had married and moved to Devon. Up to now, Agnes had been dismissed as simple, perhaps even dim, but Miss Marple had spent a lifetime learning the difference between ignorance and observation. The opportunity to speak with her arose that evening, just before supper, when Miss Marple found her folding linens in the scullery, her hands trembling slightly over a stack of damask napkins. "My dear," Miss Marple said gently, "you look as if you've seen a ghost." Agnes started so violently she nearly dropped the entire stack. "Oh, Miss Marple, I didn't hear you come in." "No, I imagine not. You were deep in thought. A dangerous thing in this house, at the moment." Agnes blinked rapidly, her lip trembling. "I didn't mean nothing. I mean, I haven't done anything." "No, of course not," Miss Marple said soothingly. "But sometimes, even when we do nothing, we see or hear something that matters." There was a beat of silence, and then Agnes burst into tears. Miss Marple waited patiently. When the sobs had quieted to sniffles, she handed the girl a lace-edged handkerchief and offered a seat on the scullery stool. "I shouldn't say," Agnes whispered, "but I heard it." "I did. Heard what, dear?" "That night. Just before dessert was served. I was outside the dining room, near the sideboard, fetching the silver. The door was open just a crack. I didn't mean to linger, honest. But I heard voices." Miss Marple gave her the calm nod of encouragement she had used many times before, particularly on Sunday school children with guilty consciences. Agnes continued, "It was Mr. Beckett, and someone else. A man's voice. Angry. He said, 'If you open your mouth, I'll bury you with that letter.' And Mr. Beckett said something about duty and truth. He said, 'This can't stay buried, not even for her sake.' And then there was a sound, like someone slammed a hand on the table." "Did you see who the other voice belonged to?" Agnes shook her head. "No, miss, but he spoke low, not like the Colonel. He's got a booming voice. This one was quieter, steady but angry." Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice quiet. "And did anyone see you there, Agnes?" She hesitated. "I thought not. But later I passed Mr. Gowans on the stairs. He looked at me odd, like he knew." Miss Marple rose slowly, her mind racing. She thanked Agnes, promised discretion, and left her in the scullery, still wiping her eyes. She didn't go far. Instead, she lingered in the hallway just outside the library where she knew Inspector Dover would be reviewing Beckett's letter again. She stepped in quietly. "She heard it," she said, without preamble. The inspector looked up, puzzled. "Heard what?" "A conversation, just before dessert, between Beckett and an unknown man. She heard threats and she heard the name of the letter. And Mr. Gowans may know she heard it." Dover straightened. "The butler?" "I wouldn't accuse him of anything yet," Miss Marple said gently. "But he sees much. And if someone threatened Beckett, the real question is whether it was done to silence him or to protect someone else." Dover grunted. "Beckett had enemies. We already know that." "Indeed. But listen closely to what he said. This can't stay buried, not even for her sake. That suggests he was protecting someone, possibly Lady Fawley. But who else might have feared exposure?" They both paused. "Edward Ambrose," Dover muttered. "The hidden heir." Miss Marple nodded. "He may have been written back into the will, but he's still a question mark. Where is he? Why hasn't he come forward?" They made inquiries that night. The village solicitor remembered the name. Ambrose's illegitimate son. Raised abroad, never acknowledged in public. Lady Fawley had gone to great lengths to suppress the scandal. No one had heard from him since before the war. But someone must have. The next day, the constable returned from Lower Wickfield with news. A man had taken up residence at a boarding house under the name Edwin Marston. Quiet, well-dressed, kept to himself. Paid in cash. The matron thought he might have had an accent, Canadian maybe. Miss Marple and Dover visited the boarding house that afternoon. The room was empty, the bed was made, but the waste bin was full. Inside, they found burnt fragments of a letter. The edges were scorched, but the middle remained intact enough to read a single line. "I will not stand by while you destroy what my father left me." "Edward Ambrose," Dover said. He was here, Miss Marple nodded slowly, and perhaps he feared Beckett would not protect the truth after all. But that makes him the suspect, Dover said. He had motive, opportunity, and if he posed as the missing dinner guest, Miss Marple interrupted quietly. Not if the real killer wants us to think it was him. She turned the last unburnt scrap over in her hands. A date was scribbled in the margin, 2 days before Beckett's death, meaning Edward had warned someone he knew what was coming. But if that were true, why would he kill the only man protecting his inheritance? That night, Miss Marple walked the halls of Greystone once more. The manor was silent, save for the creak of age in its bones. She paused at the scullery door. Something caught her eye, a glint beneath the shelf. She stooped, reached for it, and retrieved a brooch. Gold with a faint design, a spiral. The same insignia Beckett had used. It wasn't Lady Fawley's. Miss Marple knew her jewellery too well, but it was feminine. Agnes had said she'd only heard men's voices. But what if there was a third presence in the room? Someone quiet, someone listening. The next morning, Miss Marple returned to the scullery, where Agnes worked with her usual nervous energy. Miss Marple held out the brooch. This was beneath the shelf. Agnes looked at it and paled. I don't know how— Agnes, Miss Marple said gently, you were not alone when you listened, were you? Agnes looked down. No, miss, I thought I was. But after I ran, I heard someone else come down the corridor. Soft shoes. Then I heard the pantry door close. Do you know who it was? Agnes shook her head. Miss Marple patted her hand. You've been braver than you know. But you must be careful now. Someone in this house doesn't want the truth to be known. And as she walked away, Miss Marple knew exactly what she had to do next. Because somewhere behind a scullery door, a quiet woman had heard too much, and now Miss Marple had proof someone else had been listening too, and that someone had left behind their mark. Chapter 5. The Will That Was Written Twice. It was the sort of morning that never properly began. A soft, stubborn rain clung to the windows of Greystone Manor like a veil, blurring the hedgerows and weighing down the garden with a sodden gloom. Inside, the house held its breath in the hush that often follows death, as though afraid to speak too loudly for fear of what might answer. A fire snapped softly in the drawing room, but its cheer failed to warm the chill in the air or the tension that had rooted itself in the floorboards. Miss Marple sat in the library with Inspector Dover, the two of them reviewing every fragment that had surfaced in the days since Harold Beckett collapsed at the dinner table. A poisoned fork, a vanished Lady Fawley, a secret letter posted after death, and a forged page of a will. Each piece pointed in one direction, and yet the picture remained infuriatingly incomplete. That changed just before 11 o'clock, when the village solicitor, Mr. Archibald Snipe, a nervous, balding man with a fondness for flannel waistcoats, arrived unannounced, clutching a leather folio as though it contained a viper. I didn't know if I should come, he said, wringing his hands, but it's too strange not to mention, and it's been weighing on me. Inspector Dover raised a brow. Go on, Mr. Snipe. I was reviewing the Fawley estate documents yesterday evening, Snipe explained, opening the folio with shaking fingers. It's standard practice after a death, especially with legal complications. I came across this tucked behind an old copy of the land survey for the West Field. I thought it was a duplicate at first. He slid out a thin sheaf of papers. Miss Marple leaned forward, reading the first few lines. It was a will, typed, formal, precise. Sir Ambrose Fawley's name appeared at the top, along with the correct date, address, and legal verbiage. But as she turned the page, her lips pursed. It names Edward Ambrose Fawley as sole heir, she said, quietly. Snipe nodded. That's the odd part. The signed version in the records names Charlotte Fawley and her son, Stephen, as primary beneficiaries. This one, This version leaves everything to Edward. But it's unsigned. Dover frowned. So it's worthless? Miss Marple's eyes were still scanning. Not necessarily. This draft was clearly prepared in good faith, likely by Beckett himself. Look here. The notary margin is filled in. The date is only 3 days before the signed copy. And notice, this, typed on different paper, slightly thicker. This isn't from Beckett's office. It's from a private typewriter. Snipe blinked. How can you tell? The faint embossing of the ribbon on the back of the page, she said. It suggests a heavier type arm, older machine. Not the sort a modern solicitor would use. But more to the point, it raises a question. Why did Sir Ambrose draft a will leaving everything to Edward, only to later sign one that leaves him out entirely? Inspector Dover rubbed his chin. He changed his mind. Or, Miss Marple said slowly, someone persuaded him to. They questioned Mr. Snipe further. The document had been hidden among unrelated papers, its edges slightly curled, as though hurriedly filed away. It bore no signature, but at the bottom corner of the last page, just above the footer, was a small mark, a spiral. Beckett's symbol, Miss Marple whispered. Dover stood. We need to speak to Stephen Fawley. Stephen, Lady Fawley's son, was a tall, handsome man, his early 30s, with a cool demeanour that suggested breeding but concealed more ambition than kindness. He had been quiet since his mother's disappearance, claiming to be devastated, though his expressions carried a kind of practised grief. They found him in the music room, seated at the piano, striking solitary chords without melody. Mr. Fawley, Dover began, we've uncovered a second version of your father's will. An earlier draft. Stephen's fingers stilled. Another version? Yes. It names Edward Ambrose Fawley as sole heir. There was a beat of silence, then a short, dry laugh. I suppose that was inevitable. That boy was always a thorn in my mother's side. She spent years pretending he didn't exist. Miss Marple spoke gently. But your father did not pretend. He tried to make amends. Stephen's jaw tensed. What are you suggesting? That your mother may have convinced him to change his mind. Stephen rose. My father was not a fool, Miss Marple. He knew blood wasn't everything. Edward was a scandal, a reminder of shame. My mother only wanted what was decent. Or what was hers, Miss Marple murmured. Stephen's face darkened. I'd watch your tone. But Miss Marple only looked at him calmly. Was it your mother who asked Beckett to destroy the original will? I don't know anything about that, Stephen snapped. Beckett was private. He didn't tell me anything. No, Miss Marple said softly. But perhaps you read something you weren't meant to. Later that evening, Miss Marple took the opportunity to speak again with Agnes. The maid had grown more confident since their last conversation, perhaps buoyed by the knowledge that her observations were no longer considered idle gossip. Miss Marple, she whispered, eyes wide. There's something else. Yes, dear? That afternoon, before the dinner, I saw Mr. Stephen in the study. He was going through Mr. Beckett's briefcase. He said he was looking for a cigar, but, well, it seemed odd. He jumped when I walked in. Miss Marple nodded, her suspicions confirmed. Stephen had likely found the unsigned will, or something else he wanted kept quiet. The puzzle was nearly complete. If the original will left everything to Edward, and if Beckett had kept a copy for safety, then someone had every reason to silence him. But who had the opportunity? Charlotte Fawley had vanished. Stephen had been present at the dinner. The mystery guest in Dr. Norris's seat remained unconfirmed. But that night, while the rest of the house lay silent, Miss Marple returned to the library. She retrieved the unsigned will again, holding it to the firelight. There was something else, barely noticeable. She tilted the page. There, pressed into the paper, was a faint indent. Someone had written on the top of the will while it rested on another surface. She gently shaded the area with pencil. A single line emerged. Make it disappear. No one must know. The handwriting was unmistakable. It belonged to Charlotte Forley. Miss Marple stood very still. The unsigned will was not lost. It had been hidden. On her orders. The next move she suspected would not be made in daylight. But the house, like the truth, was beginning to give up its secrets. Chapter 6. The Portrait That Faced the Wrong Way. The rain came again in the small hours of the morning, a persistent tapping against the tall windows of Greystone Manor, as though some unseen thing were gently knocking, asking to be let in. It was not a violent storm, not like the one that had raged on the night of Harold Beckett's death. This one was quieter, softer, but no less sinister for it. The kind of rain that seeps into the walls and stays there, long after the weather has passed. Miss Marple had not slept. She'd spent the night reading through old clippings in the study, poring over the notes she'd made from Agnes's whispers, the unsigned will, the vanished heir, and the lies, so many lies, told to preserve reputation and legacy. The house was restless. She could feel it. Its secrets had begun to stir. At a little after 5 o'clock, just before dawn, Miss Marple rose from her chair and walked slowly to the hearth. The fire had long since burned to embers. Her eyes scanned the study half lit by the dim grey creeping in through the window panes. The large oil portrait that hung above the mantel, Sir Ambrose Forley in military regalia, was still there, but something about it struck her. She tilted her head. The painting was askew, angled slightly to the right, not enough to notice in passing, perhaps, but Miss Marple never missed such things. The night before, she had glanced at that portrait many times, and she remembered it clearly. Centred, straight, imposing. Now, it was off. She moved closer. The frame was heavy and ornate, dark with age. She reached out and gently straightened it. As she did, her fingers brushed the edge of the wall behind the canvas. She paused. Something caught, a thin ridge of air. She stepped back, narrowed her eyes, and reached behind the frame. Her fingers found a small brass latch sunken into the wall, long untouched by dust. A compartment, hidden. Carefully, Miss Marple lifted the painting from its mount and set it down on the floor with surprising strength for a woman of her age. Behind it, where the stone wall should have been, was a shallow panel, slightly recessed and painted to match the surrounding wood. The latch gave way with a soft click, and the panel opened inward. Inside was a small cavity, no larger than a drawer. Within it lay a folded paper yellowing at the edges and a small velvet pouch. She opened the paper first. It was a letter, typed, then signed by hand in an elegant, deliberate script. To whom? It may concern. This is the original draft of my revised testament. Should the signed copy be tampered with or destroyed, I entrust its discovery only to those with the will to seek the truth. My conscience demands acknowledgement of my son, Edward. Let this serve as my true intention, sealed and hidden, beyond manipulation. Sir Ambrose Forley. Miss Marple exhaled softly. She had suspected there was more than one version of the will, but this was something else entirely. A confession, hidden deliberately. A document meant to outlast deceit. She opened the velvet pouch next. Inside was a signet ring. Heavy gold. The family crest engraved deep into its face. Edward's birthright. Someone had hidden this. And someone else had turned the portrait in the dark hours of the night, not in anger, but with purpose. To retrieve or to conceal. She heard the creak of a floorboard behind her. Couldn't sleep either, came Inspector Dover's voice. She turned, surprised but not startled. It seems the walls don't rest any better than we do. He stepped into the study, blinking at the open panel. His eyes widened. What's that? She handed him the letter. He read it once, then again, slower. So this is the real will? "It is not legally binding," Miss Marple said, "but it reveals Sir Ambrose's true intent. He feared tampering. It seems he was right to." Dover's jaw tightened. "You think Charlotte Fawley found this?" "I think someone did," Miss Marple said. "Last night. Likely while the house slept." "But if they already had the signed version, why come back for this? Perhaps to destroy it, or to see if anything else remained. Perhaps—" She paused, her eyes drifting toward the floor. "Perhaps they didn't expect it to still be here." She replaced the items, then closed the panel and hung the portrait once more, this time centered. The moment it clicked into place, she turned to Dover again. "There's something else," she said. "When I first looked at that portrait, I noticed something in the background. A detail. Faded but distinct." Dover frowned. "A detail?" Miss Marple retrieved a small magnifying glass from her handbag, one she carried not only for embroidery, and held it to the bottom left corner of the canvas. There, just behind Sir Ambrose's shoulder, was the faint impression of a bookcase, and in that bookcase, unmistakably rendered, was a single red volume standing out from its fellows. Dover squinted. "That's just artistic detail, isn't it?" "No," she said softly. "That book isn't there." She moved quickly across the room to the actual bookcase that mirrored the one in the portrait. Her fingers traced the rows of leather-bound volumes until they reached the fourth shelf, second from the left, where a gap clearly showed. Dust lined the shelf, undisturbed, save for a clean rectangle where a book had once been. Dover moved beside her. "You're saying someone took the book?" "Yes," Miss Marple said, "and they knew exactly which one." "What do you think it was?" "I believe it was the book that contained the earlier draft of the will, or at the very least, a letter, possibly a confession." "And it's missing now?" "It is." Dover rubbed his temple. "Which means someone in this house still has something to hide." Miss Marple was already turning toward the hall. "We must search the rooms, quietly, but thoroughly." They began in the east wing, checking wardrobes, writing desks, valises. Nothing. Not until they reached the guest room that had been assigned to Stephen Fawley. Inside, the bed was made, but the room was not unoccupied. Stephen himself stood by the window, fully dressed, a cigarette burning slowly in his hand. He turned when they entered, his expression unreadable. "Inspector, Miss Marple. You're early." "We're looking for something," Dover said, stepping forward. Stephen arched a brow. "Do tell." "A red book," Miss Marple said. "Leather-bound. From the library." Stephen's expression didn't change, but his left hand, a hand not holding the cigarette, twitched slightly. The slightest tremor. Barely a breath. "Plenty of red books in the library," he said, exhaling. "Hard to say what's missing." Dover glanced around the room. "Mind if we take a look?" "Please," Stephen said, stepping aside with exaggerated courtesy. Miss Marple went straight to the wardrobe. Inside, among suits and a folded umbrella, was a briefcase. Unlocked. She opened it carefully. There, resting on top of a pile of typed letters, was a red leather-bound book. Dover took it and opened the front cover. Inside was a letter, folded, thick with age. It was addressed in Sir Ambrose's hand, to Edward A. Fawley. The seal was intact. Miss Marple stepped closer. And yet, it was never sent. Stephen remained motionless. "I believe your father intended to deliver this himself," Miss Marple said gently. "But he never did, and someone, perhaps fearing what it might contain, kept it from being found." Dover looked at him sharply. "You knew this was in your room?" Stephen didn't answer, but in that silence, something shifted. A sound, quiet, from the hallway. A creak of footsteps. Miss Marple turned sharply toward the door, but it was already closed. Whoever had been listening was gone. She stepped into the hall. Empty. But on the floor near the stairwell, barely noticeable, was a trail of water. Small droplets, rain from a coat, or wet shoes. She bent to touch one, still fresh. Someone had come from outside, recently, and entered the manor. Not a guest, not staff, but someone with a key. Miss Marple looked up slowly. "I believe Edward has arrived," she whispered, "and I do not think he wishes to be found." Chapter 7. The room no one slept. In it was the housekeeper, Mrs. Pembroke, who noticed it first. A matter of routine, she claimed, and not something she would have thought twice about under normal circumstances. But nothing in Greystone Manor had been normal since the night Harold Beckett collapsed into his trifle. That morning, as pale sunlight tried and failed to pierce the mist that lay heavy over the estate, Mrs. Pembroke stood frowning at the bed in the guest room on the second floor. The blue room, as it was known. It was made, yes, but imperfectly. The top sheet bore a visible crease where someone had lain. The pillow was slightly indented, and when she pressed her hand to the mattress, it was still faintly warm. Miss Marple was summoned at once. She arrived in her soft-heeled shoes, as unobtrusive as ever, but with her eyes alert and clear. She moved through the room slowly, pausing at each object, her fingertips brushing against the bedpost, the edge of the dressing table, the discarded matchbook on the bedside table. She lifted the matchbook delicately. "Matches from the King's Arm," she murmured. "In Lower Wickfield." "That's where they say Edward was staying," the inspector said, joining her in the doorway. "Was," Miss Marple corrected. "Past tense." Dover nodded grimly. "No one's seen him since yesterday morning." "And now this?" "The room was assigned to Dr. Norris, wasn't it?" "It was," Dover confirmed, "but he sent a telegram saying he wouldn't attend." "You remember?" "I do, and I remember Agnes saying someone sat in his place at dinner." Dover looked toward the bed. "So you think he came anyway?" "Used the room?" "I think someone used it," Miss Marple said, lifting the pillow and examining the inner seam. She frowned, then picked something free. A dark, fine thread. Dover squinted. "Cloth." "Wool," Miss Marple said. "Of the sort used in men's jackets. Not from the blankets." Dover crossed his arms. "So, someone arrived late, took a guest's place at the dinner, and slept in a room under another man's name. Then vanished before morning." "But not without leaving something behind," Miss Marple added. She turned to the wardrobe. Inside were hangers, 2 empty, one bearing a long coat, slightly damp. She reached into the inner pocket and retrieved a folded scrap of paper. She opened it. The handwriting was hurried, jagged. "He lied. The letter isn't gone. She kept it. If anything happens, tell them it wasn't me. E." Dover exhaled slowly. "Edward," Miss Marple nodded. "He was here." "But where is he now?" "That," she said quietly, "is the question." Downstairs, in the morning room, Stephen Fawley poured himself coffee with a surgeon's precision. His suit was immaculate, his demeanour calm. But Miss Marple watched the way his eyes flicked toward the door each time it opened, as if bracing for something. Or someone. "I suppose we're all suspects now," he said when Miss Marple entered. "Have we not been all along?" she asked mildly. He smiled thinly. "You don't believe I killed Beckett, do you?" "I believe your father intended to leave the estate to Edward. I believe your mother knew. And I believe Harold Beckett died because someone feared the truth." "Truth is a slippery thing," Stephen said, sipping his coffee. "Especially in this house." Miss Marple studied him. "You weren't in your room last night." He didn't blink. "I walked. The house was stifling." "You didn't happen to stop by the blue room?" He looked up slowly. "Why would I?" Miss Marple didn't answer. She turned to leave, but just as she reached the door, he spoke again. "If Edward was here, he's a fool. He's never been anything but trouble." "And yet," she said softly, "your father saw something else in him." She left Stephen with his coffee and his bitterness and found Inspector Dover in the study. He had the note from Edward spread out on the desk, beside the matchbook and the scrap of wool thread. "He says it wasn't him," Dover muttered. And maybe it wasn't. But if he's telling the truth, who is he protecting? Miss Marple said nothing for a moment. Then she pointed to the corner of the note. Do you see that? Dover leaned in. A smudge. A thumbprint. In ink. And? Not Edward's. He wrote it, but someone else handled it after. Stephen. Possibly. Or someone trying to find Edward's whereabouts. Someone who entered that room perhaps after he'd gone. They searched the manor again, this time more deliberately. The staff were questioned, rooms were examined, and finally, in the old linen cupboard at the end of the hall, beneath a pile of unused sheets, they found it. A small satchel, half open, with a bloodied handkerchief tucked inside. Wrapped in the handkerchief was a penknife, not new, worn, but sharp, and on the blade, red-brown, rusted dry, was what looked very much like dried blood. Miss Marple took the knife gently. There was something carved into the handle. Initials. E.A.F., Edward Ambrose Fawley, Dover, said, his voice low. Miss Marple held the knife delicately, her mind already racing ahead. He didn't stab Beckett. Cyanide killed Beckett. And yet, this suggests violence. Perhaps a struggle. Or a second attempt, Dover said. Maybe someone meant to kill again. Miss Marple shook her head. I don't think this was meant for Harold. She turned the blade over again. No, she whispered. This wasn't left behind. It was hidden. Dover looked at her. Edward tried to defend himself? Or someone else tried to frame him, Miss Marple said. They stared at each other for a long moment. Then the constable arrived, breathless. Miss Marple. Sir. You'd better come outside. There's something in the woodshed. The shed stood at the edge of the property, near the stone wall that marked the beginning of the thick woods. The path was slick with rain, and the air was dense with the smell of wet earth and rotting bark. Inside the shed, amidst the stacks of firewood and the sharp tang of sawdust, was a coat. Soaked. Torn. And, beneath it, curled against the wall, unconscious but breathing. Edward. Miss Marple knelt beside him as Dover called for a blanket. His face was bruised, one eye swollen shut, his hands scraped raw. But when he opened his mouth to speak, it was not pain that filled his voice. It was fear. She knows, he croaked. She knows about the letter. Miss Marple leaned close. Who, Edward? His lips trembled. She's not gone. She never left. She's watching all of us. And then he fell into darkness again. Outside, the rain began again in earnest, and inside, Miss Marple turned toward the manor, her face set. Charlotte Fawley had never left Greystone, and now Miss Marple knew exactly where to find her. Chapter 8. The Whisper from the Dusty Ledger. It had rained again overnight, harder this time. The gravel drive at Greystone Manor was slick with mud, and the ivy along the north wing sagged under the weight of water. Inside, the manor felt dimmer, as if the storm had soaked into the walls. Miss Marple moved quietly through the corridors, her shawl wrapped tightly about her shoulders. Edward had been found in the woodshed the night before, battered, half-conscious, and whispering about someone who had never left, someone watching, someone who knew. But it wasn't just his reappearance that troubled her. It was the sense, so keen in her now, that every surface in this house was trying to hide something. Even the very walls seemed to flinch from the truth. Inspector Dover, bleary-eyed but sharp, met her in the foyer as the maid Agnes scurried past with a mop. He's still unconscious, Dover said without ceremony. Doctor says he may come to in a few hours, but... Miss Marple raised a hand, gently. He's done his part for now. He gave us the name we needed. Now we must listen to what the house has to say. Dover frowned. The house? The Ledgers, Miss Marple said simply. Dover followed her to the old reception room, a seldom-used corner of the manor near the front hall, where visitors had once signed their names on arrival, back when Greystone had played host to country weekends and summer concerts, long before it became the stage for betrayal and death. There, tucked away in a Cabinet beneath the disused bell panel, Miss Marple unearthed what she was looking for, a thick, leather-bound guest book, the edges flaking with age. She carried it reverently to a nearby desk, blew the dust from its cover, and opened it slowly. The entries began in 1907 and ran through the decades, page after page of visitors carefully signing their names with dates and brief notes. Charming stay, excellent snipe shooting, delightful concert. The handwriting grew looser after the war. The names more infrequent. Miss Marple turned the pages one by one, stopping occasionally to trace a date with her finger. Then she paused. There, 2 pages from the end, nestled between a Mr. and Mrs. Darlington of Bath and a Reverend Oswald Trim, was a name written in cramped slanted script, Mr. Lionel Greaves, dated 2 years prior. Miss Marple stared at it. "Lionel Greaves," she said aloud. Dover peered over her shoulder. "Doesn't ring a bell." "It should," Miss Marple murmured, "because Lionel Greaves is dead. Died in a hunting accident in Kenya, nearly 3 years ago. I remember reading the obituary in the Times. A minor aristocrat. No close family." "So someone used his name?" "Yes," Miss Marple said. "The question is, who?" She examined the signature again, her eyes narrowing. There was something forced about the flow of it, like someone trying to remember how to form letters they hadn't used in some time. And then she saw it. The loop of the G, identical to the one in the forged note hidden in the blue room. She looked up. "I believe the man calling himself Lionel Greaves was in this house again, recently, under another name." Dover blinked. "Wait, are you saying he came back?" "I believe he never left." They returned to the study. Miss Marple retrieved the note found with Edward's coat. "He lied. The letter isn't gone," and placed it beside the guestbook entry. The handwriting was different enough to fool the casual observer, but not Miss Marple. The loops, the pressure on the downward strokes, the way the T was crossed low. These were not random. They were habits. The man calling himself Lionel Greaves had returned to Greystone Manor under another name. "Dr. Lionel Norris," Miss Marple said suddenly. Dover's head jerked up. The guest who never arrived. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Precisely. Or, so we were told. A convenient name, a convenient absence, and yet his place at the table was set, his room prepared, and someone sat in that chair." Dover swore under his breath. "So he was never a doctor?" "No," Miss Marple said softly. "He was an imposter, one with a reason to come back, one with a reason to stop Beckett from revealing the truth about the will." Dover leaned forward. "But why go through so much trouble? The aliases, the ledgers, the dinner." "Because this isn't only about inheritance," she said. "It's about identity. About someone who has lived in the shadows so long they've forgotten how to live in the light." They spent the afternoon searching the manor for any trace of Lionel Greaves, or Norris, or whatever name he used next. They found nothing in the usual places. But it was Agnes, again, who gave the next clue. "I was dusting the music room," she said nervously, "and I noticed something odd near the piano bench, a scrap of cloth caught in the lid." Miss Marple followed her to the music room. The bench was indeed closed, but a corner of fabric stuck out. Fine linen, monogrammed. Dover lifted it carefully. L.G. Not. "A coincidence?" Miss Marple said. "He was here. Hiding." "In plain sight," Dover muttered. The cloth was part of a shirt cuff, torn cleanly as if snagged in haste. Then Miss Marple's eyes drifted to the corner of the music room where a tall standing mirror reflected the windows. Behind it, barely visible, was a seam in the panelling. She moved to it, knocked gently. Hollow. They pried it open with a fire poker. Behind it was a narrow passage no more than 2 feet wide, snaking behind the walls of the manor, dust-laden but recently disturbed. A makeshift bed had been fashioned on the floor, a thin blanket, a bottle of water, a candle stub, and beside it, a torn newspaper clipping. Miss Marple bent and picked it up. The headline read, Edward Ambrose Fawley to challenge inheritance. Dated just 3 weeks earlier. Dover swore again. He knew. He was watching everything. Miss Marple nodded. He came back under a false name. He watched the dinner. Perhaps he even poisoned the fork. But what's curious, Inspector, is not that he wanted to remain hidden. She turned the clipping over. Written on the back in pencil, barely legible, were 3 words. She promised me. Miss Marple folded the scrap delicately. She said. Not he. This isn't just about Beckett. This is about Charlotte. Lady Fawley, Dover asked. Yes, Miss Marple whispered. She knew this man, perhaps from years ago, perhaps long before Greystone. He didn't come just for money. He came for revenge. They left the passage and returned to the study as night began to fall again, and the manor creaked with that peculiar tension of old wood and older secrets. Miss Marple stared at the ledger once more. Lionel Greaves. A name borrowed. A life staged. And just before she closed the book, she noticed one more thing. The entry beneath Lionel Greaves, dated the same week. Miss Cecily Durrant. Familiar. Too familiar. She turned to Dover. That's not a guest. That was Charlotte's maiden name. Dover's eyes widened. You think they came together? I think they never truly parted. Outside, the wind picked up again. Inside, Miss Marple stood still as the truth clicked into place. Charlotte had brought him here, long ago, and now he had returned, with a promise broken, and a final debt to collect. Chapter 9. The Trap Set at Tea Time. It was raining again, as it often was when truths refused to stay buried. A thin, incessant drizzle coated the windows of Greystone Manor, rendering the landscape outside a ghostly blur of trees and hedges. Inside, the drawing room had been prepared with delicate precision. Lace runners on the sideboard, the good china set out, the hearth crackling with fresh flame, and a tea trolley wheeled into place with jam tarts, thin cucumber sandwiches, and a pot of Darjeeling that Miss Marple herself had chosen. The table was set not for comfort, but confrontation. This was not a tea to soothe tempers. It was bait, and Miss Marple had laid it with the precision of a woman who had spent her life listening to the silences between people's words. The invitations had gone out that morning delivered by hand. Miss Marple had insisted it be framed as a gathering to clarify matters, restore peace, and honour the memory of the late Mr. Beckett. None had refused. They were all far too curious, or far too afraid to stay away. By 4 o'clock, the guests had assembled. Stephen Fawley, composed as ever, in his dark suit with silver cufflinks, Colonel Luscombe, looking uncharacteristically twitchy, Mrs. Pembroke, the housekeeper, clearly nervous but trying to keep her chin high, young Agnes, pale and stiff, and finally a man no one had seen arrive, a gaunt figure with hollow cheeks, damp collar, and an expression like scorched paper. Lionel Greaves, or rather, the man who had once used that name and then discarded it when it no longer suited. He did not introduce himself. He simply entered with a nod and stood behind one of the high-backed chairs, saying nothing. But his presence changed the air in the room, and Miss Marple knew the moment had come. "I thank you all for coming," she said gently, folding her hands in front of her. "We are nearing the end of this painful chapter, but I fear some things must still be spoken plainly." Colonel Luscombe cleared his throat. "If this is about the solicitor again, Miss Marple, It is," she said, interrupting gently but firmly. "And about the letter he sent, the one he wrote after he was already dead." Stephen smirked faintly. A theatrical touch, if you ask me. "Quite, but not Beckett's doing. The letter was real, yes, but its delivery was delayed by someone else. Someone in this room." There was a brief pause. A few glances shifted toward Agnes, who flinched. "I didn't touch no letter, I swear," she whispered. No, Miss Marple said kindly, but you heard things, including something very important. Someone threatening Mr. Beckett before dessert was served. Agnes nodded quickly, eyes wide. Miss Marple continued. And then there's the matter of Dr. Lionel Norris, a guest who never arrived, or so we were told. And yet, someone sat in his place at dinner. Someone who signed the guest book 2 years ago under the name Lionel Greaves. The gaunt man said nothing, but his jaw clenched, and Miss Marple saw the tremor in his fingers. You came back because of the will, she said to him gently. Because it named you, and because someone promised you your rightful place would be restored. Across the table, Stevens spoke coldly. And who, exactly, promised that? Miss Marple turned toward him. Your mother. There was a murmur around the room. Colonel Luscombe shifted uncomfortably in his seat. She knew Edward existed. She feared the scandal of it, yes. But she made a promise. Long ago, to a frightened boy who had been cast aside, she promised she would find a way to make it right. But instead, she betrayed him again. She persuaded Sir Ambrose to sign the second will, and when Beckett found the original, she panicked. Stephen gave a brittle smile. And you expect us to believe she killed Beckett herself? No, Miss Marple said. She didn't. She fled before she could. The room went silent. Miss Marple stepped toward the hearth and pulled something from behind the mantle. It was a small velvet pouch, one identical to the one that had held Sir Ambrose's signet ring. Inside this one was another ring, this one smaller, older, engraved with a different crest, and tucked beneath it was a folded letter. She handed the letter to Inspector Dover, who stood by the door with arms folded. He opened it and read aloud. If I cannot undo what I've done, I can at least leave the truth behind. He was my son. He deserved more than lies and silence. Forgive me for what I let happen. I never meant for it to end this way. Charlotte Stevens' face had turned grey. She wrote that, Miss Marple said. Before she disappeared, she hid it behind the fireplace in the West Wing. Not many people know there's a crawl space behind the flue. But Charlotte did. Stevens stood up. You found her? No, Miss Marple said softly. But I know where she is, and I know who's been helping her stay hidden. All eyes turned to Colonel Luscombe, who suddenly looked like a man sitting on a wasp's nest. I didn't mean to, he stammered. She begged me. She said it was just until things calmed down. I gave her keys to the gardener's lodge, that's all. She's still on the grounds? Dover asked sharply. Luscombe nodded miserably. She's in the old gamekeeper's cottage. Hasn't left since the night Beckett died. Dover stepped to the door, motioned to the constable outside. Miss Marple turned back to the group. But Charlotte didn't kill Beckett. She may have lied, may have hidden the truth. But she didn't poison that fork. Someone else did. Someone who had more to lose than inheritance. She paused, looking each person in the eye. The person who poisoned Beckett also tried to frame Edward, who had only just returned. They placed the knife. They tore the shirt. They planted the matchbook from the king's arm. They needed Edward to disappear. Again. Her eyes fell on Stephen. He didn't speak. You found out about the original will, Miss Marple said. Perhaps you overheard your mother speaking to Beckett, or perhaps Beckett threatened to show it to the court. Either way, you realised your place in the family, your control, was at risk. So you acted. You poisoned the fork. You made it look like Charlotte had panicked. Then you set the stage for Edward's guilt. Stephen's face remained blank. That's quite the theory, he said. But no proof. Miss Marple smiled faintly. No? Then perhaps you'll explain why you were in the pantry the night before Beckett's death, handling a bottle of silver cyanide used for cleaning silverware, one that was missing a stopper. Stephen's mouth opened, then closed. Agnes, from the far end of the room, whispered, I saw him. I didn't mean to spy, but I saw him through the crack in the door. Stephen stood slowly. "You're all mad," he said, low and sharp. "You'd take the word of a half-wit maid and an old woman over mine?" "I would," Dover said, "especially with motive, witness, and opportunity." Stephen stepped back, then turned sharply toward the window, but 2 constables were already there. He froze. Miss Marple stepped forward, her voice quiet but firm. "You tried to erase someone," she said, "but Edward was not the one who didn't belong." Outside, the rain had lightened to a fine mist. Inside, the trap had closed. Not at dinner, but over tea, where masks were lowered and conversation flowed freely. And in the quiet that followed, Miss Marple knew. The final pieces were still to come, but the killer had taken his last sip. Chapter 10. The Name Carved Beneath the Window. It was in the early hours of morning when the constables took Stephen Fawley from Greystone Manor. Rain whispered across the gravel as the motorcar pulled away, and the manor stood watching as if the old house itself were holding its breath, uncertain if the storm had truly passed or if another waited just behind it. Inside, the silence had changed. Not gone exactly, but altered. The kind of hush that follows a revelation, when every wall that once concealed something now stands bare, exposed, trembling under the weight of what it must now hold openly. Miss Marple did not sleep that night. Her shawl was wrapped tightly around her shoulders as she sat in the drawing room, a cup of untouched tea cooling beside her. The fire had long died, leaving a faint chill that crept across the floorboards. Inspector Dover had stayed an hour after the arrest, pacing and rubbing his temples, not quite satisfied despite having his man in custody. But Miss Marple had not spoken much, not even when he'd offered her quiet praise, because something still itched at the corners of her mind. Something unfinished. And in all her years of listening, watching, waiting, she had learned to trust that itch. At 6:30, just as the sky was lightening into a grim pewter dawn, Agnes appeared at the doorway. Her face was pale, her shoes damp. She was clutching a bundle of linens that had clearly not been freshly folded. "Miss Marple," she whispered, "there's something I think you should see." Miss Marple followed her without question. Agnes led her not to one of the grand rooms, but to the servants' wing, to a small, narrow room with a low ceiling and a cracked window that looked out onto the north garden. The room had been empty for years, Agnes explained, ever since the old gardener's boy had left after the war. But she had been cleaning it in case Edward needed a quieter place to recover. Dr. Percival had said he might prefer less noise. "I opened the shutters," Agnes said, voice trembling, "and I saw it. Just there." She pointed to the wooden windowsill, warped with time and speckled with old rain stains. Miss Marple bent down, adjusted her glasses and saw it immediately. Carved, faint but deliberate into the underside of the sill was a name. Cecily. Not just a name, but a memory. Miss Marple stood motionless, the name echoing in her mind like a whisper, long buried. Cecily Durrant. Charlotte Fawley's maiden name. But it wasn't. The name itself that stirred her so. It was the childishness of the carving. The way the letters leaned awkwardly, carved with some determination. Not grace. It had been etched by a hand, young, likely frightened, and wanting, desperately to belong. "She lived in this room," Miss Marple murmured, "not as a guest, as a girl." Agnes nodded. "Mr. Gowans said as much once. Said Lady Fawley wasn't always so grand. She grew up here. Before she married Sir Ambrose, the pieces settled like dust falling, quietly into place. Cecily Durrant had not married into Greystone Manor. She had returned to it. She had once lived under this roof not as mistress, but as child, perhaps ward, maybe even servant's daughter. It was never publicly spoken of course. Charlotte Fawley had always been portrayed as well-bred, refined. But the truth lay in crooked letters beneath a window, Cecily, scratched into the grain by a girl forgotten by the very house she would one day claim as hers. Miss Marple turned slowly to Agnes. "Fetch Inspector Dover, quietly. Tell him to meet me in the West Hall." Agnes nodded and hurried off, her footsteps soft. Miss Marple made her way alone to the west side of the manor, where the rooms were darker, seldom used. It was here that Charlotte had fled after Becket's death. Here she had hidden, watched, waited. And now Miss Marple understood why. She paused by a locked linen closet just past the morning room, then leaned against the adjacent wall and waited. Dover arrived, 10 minutes later, breath visible in the chill, his overcoat still damp. "You've found something," he said, reading her expression. "I've found everything," she replied softly. "Or rather, it found me." Cecily carved her name into the windowsill of the gardener's room. "Charlotte?" "Yes, Cecily Durrant. She lived here long before she became Lady Fawley. Not as heiress, but likely as the daughter of someone in service. Perhaps a maid, possibly even illegitimate." Dover's brow furrowed. "So she grew up here." "And returned under false pretences," Miss Marple said. "The name Charlotte was a reinvention. The marriage to Sir Ambrose a salvation. And, when she brought Edward into the world, she did so with every intention of giving him what she herself had never had. A name, a place. But she gave him up." "No," Miss Marple said. "He was taken from her. Likely by her husband. Sir Ambrose wouldn't have risked his spotless name, and Charlotte Cecily had already lied once to gain her position. She couldn't afford scandal. She was forced to choose between the son she loved and the life she had built. And Becket found out." Miss Marple nodded. "He helped draft the original will to leave everything to Edward. But Charlotte panicked. Not just for herself, but for her surviving son, Stephen. She persuaded Sir Ambrose to write a second will, cutting Edward out." Dover let out a low breath. "So she hid the original." "Yes, and when Becket threatened to reveal it, she feared everything would collapse." "Still," Dover said, "she didn't kill Becket." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "That was Stephen, but she helped cover it up. And she knew the man who returned as doctor. Lionel Norris was not who he said he was. She knew him from long ago. Possibly someone who knew the truth about her. Perhaps even someone she had betrayed in her climb." Dover was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "She's still here." "She never left," Miss Marple said. "She's in the cottage, but she won't come out unless I go to her." Dover opened the linen closet with a key he'd taken from Luscombe the day before. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth and hidden beneath the shelves, was a stack of documents, letters, drafts, torn pages from a diary. They took them to the drawing room. Miss Marple read them first, slowly, carefully. Then handed one to Dover. He read aloud. "I carved my name so I would not disappear. I thought if the wood held it, the house would have to remember me. But now I know the house forgets. It forgets girls like me. But it remembers the blood." Miss Marple looked at the fire. "There it is," she said quietly. "Her motive, not just to lie or conceal, but to survive, to be remembered, not erased." Dover didn't speak for a while. Then, "What happens now?" "She'll speak," Miss Marple said. "To me." Outside, the rain had slowed. The air was raw, heavy with mud and memory. Inside, the manor waited. And beneath one forgotten window, a name remained. Not hidden, but remembered and ready, at last, to speak. Chapter 11. The Murderer Who Served the Wine. The storm had passed, but the skies above Greystone Manor remained heavy, as if the clouds had not yet made up their minds whether to release their weight or recede into silence. The grounds were slick with mud, the hedges drooping under days of rain, and the gravel drive wore the ruts of too many cars coming and going. The house, for all its stately angles and manicured facade, had begun to feel like a stage after a performance, tarnished by what had occurred, and heavy with the weight of what had not yet been said. Miss Marple moved quietly through the breakfast room, the morning light diffused and pale through the gauzy curtains. Inspector Dover stood at the sideboard, stirring sugar into his tea with an air of distracted satisfaction. "Stephen confessed last night," he said, not looking up. "Not all of it, not directly, but enough. It's over, Miss Marple." Miss Marple, seated with her hands folded in her lap, gave him a small, patient smile. "I'm afraid it's not." Dover turned. "You think there's more?" "I'm certain of it." He frowned. "But Stephen poisoned Beckett. We've found the motive, the forged will, the poisoned fork, the false trail laid for Edward. It all fits." "Yes," Miss Marple said, "except for one small thing." "Who poured the wine?" Dover blinked. "The wine?" Miss Marple's voice remained soft. "At dinner that night, there were 8 guests. Everyone accounted for. Stephen, Lady Fawley, Beckett, Luscombe, Agnes, at the door myself. And yet, no one can remember who poured the wine." Gowans, the butler, insists he did not. He was called away to assist with a telephone message. He returned moments later to find Beckett collapsed, but the brandy decanter was already at the table. It had been opened, positioned, glasses arranged. Dover sat down slowly. So, someone else brought it in. "Someone who was not supposed to be there," Miss Marple said. "Someone not on the guest list. Someone dressed as staff." Silence held between them for a long moment. Dover's voice dropped. "You mean the killer wasn't Stephen?" "Oh, he had motive, yes. He had fear. But Stephen doesn't know how to lace a silver fork with cyanide without getting a trace on the tines, and Stephen would never take the risk of posing as someone else to slip into dinner. That kind of deception requires a certain calm, and a particular kind of history with this house." Dover set his teacup down. "The imposter. The man who used the name Lionel Greaves," she said, "and later posed as doctor. Lionel Norris." Dover leaned back, the realization dawning across his features like a slow fog lifting. "He served the wine." "He was never meant to be at the table," Miss Marple said, "but he made himself the perfect host. Quiet, unnoticed, blending in. He served the wine while Gowans was absent. He sat in the empty chair assigned to a man who never arrived. He ensured the poisoned fork reached Beckett's place. And no one noticed because he wore the mask of someone we are trained not to see. Servants blend into the background, especially when the guests are distracted." Dover's jaw worked in silence. "He was here the whole time?" "Yes," she said, "moving through the manor like a ghost. He entered through the service door before dinner, changed into a spare uniform from the laundry stores. Gowans later found one missing. He brought in the wine, laid out the glasses, slipped into Norris's chair unnoticed. And the guests never noticed. A stranger serving them. They didn't know Norris, Miss Marple said. Only his name. And that name was a smokescreen." Dover stood abruptly. "We'll search every inch of this place." Miss Marple was already standing. "There's no need. I know where he's gone." They made their way down the narrow servants' corridor that led behind the library, past the scullery, into a storage room no one had used in years. Dust clung to the air like old perfume. Behind the racks of unused table linens and broken candlesticks was a wooden panel, barely noticeable with a faint seam at the edge. Miss Marple placed her hand against it and pressed. It gave way with a soft groan. The passage beyond was dark, but the stale air told her it had been opened recently. They stepped inside. The passage curved, narrow and low, into a forgotten part of the foundation that predated most of the house. It emerged at the wine cellar beneath the east wing. There, crouched in the half-light, was a man, thin, pale, with the waxy look of someone who hadn't slept in days. He looked up, and he smiled. Miss Marple stepped forward. "You were never a doctor." "No," he said, "but I was once a friend of the family." "Cecily Durrant's friend?" she said. He inclined his head slightly. "Her mistake was thinking she could leave the past behind. that she could climb out of it without consequence, but I never forgot. You loved her, Miss Marple said quietly. He said nothing. You came back for the will, but you stayed for revenge. I came back, he said slowly, to remind them that servants remember everything. Dover moved to arrest him, but Miss Marple held up a hand. One moment, she looked the man in the eye. The poison wasn't for Beckett, was it? The man blinked. What? It was for Charlotte. You meant to place that fork at her setting, not his. There was a long silence, and then a slow, thin smile. She was supposed to sit at the head of the table, but Gowan switched her place at the last minute, said the fire was too strong there, and she'd be more comfortable nearer the sideboard. He gave a small laugh that did not reach his eyes. I waited years. And then, in the end, I killed the wrong person. Miss Marple's voice was barely above a whisper. Beckett died trying to protect the truth, and you murdered him over a grievance that was no longer real. She betrayed me, the man said, his voice hoarse, and the house let her. Dover stepped forward and pulled the man to his feet. You'll come with me. As they turned back through the passage, Miss Marple lingered a moment, her eyes scanning the stone floor. There, scratched into the wall in a shaking hand, was one final line. She promised I would never be invisible again. And now, at last, he wasn't. But at what cost? And who else, Miss Marple wondered, had made promises in this house that could no longer be kept? The answer, she knew, lay in the room no one had entered for 20 years. The nursery. Chapter 12. The twist hidden in the toast. The rain had stopped, but the air remained thick with the aftertaste of storm. Clouds hovered like bruises over the moors, reluctant to move on. Greystone Manor, hunched under its ivy-clad shoulders, seemed neither relieved nor mournful, merely waiting. Inside, the dining room had been cleared, the decanters sealed, the silver polished and returned to the cabinets, and yet something in the room lingered. A ghost not of a person, but of a moment. A toast. A dark smile. And a death that had meant to be a message. Miss Marple stood at the hearth, one hand resting on the edge of the cold mantelpiece, staring across the empty length of the table. Her expression was unreadable. Not puzzled, not triumphant, merely intent. Beside her, Inspector Dover tapped his pencil against his notebook, trying not to betray his impatience. You've already found your killer, he said. He confessed. The man who posed as Norris. You yourself caught him in the cellar. Miss Marple nodded faintly. Yes, Inspector. But the question we never asked was, why did he need to pose as anyone at all? Because he wanted to infiltrate the dinner, poison the fork, set the scene. Indeed, she said quietly. But I keep coming back to the toast. Lady Fawley's toast, remember? To our charming company, she said, and to Colonel Luscombe, for whom no dinner party is ever complete without a tale of scandal and a questionable punchline. Dover blinked. Yes, so. She didn't just say it offhand. She was reading. From a card. A note, perhaps. Something prepared. Dover frowned. You think she was trying to say something? I think, Miss Marple said, her voice soft and certain, she was trying to tell us everything. She moved from the hearth and retrieved a small black notebook from her handbag. Inside, pressed between 2 pages, was a card, slightly stained at the corner from brandy, the handwriting delicate but firm. She laid it on the table. To our charming company, Dover read aloud, and to Colonel Luscombe, for whom no dinner party is ever complete without a tale of scandal and a questionable punchline. C. Note the phrasing, Miss Marple said. Not no party is complete, but no dinner party is ever complete. That word ever struck me as odd. Unnecessary, unless one intended to emphasize something. Dover looked at her blankly. It was an acrostic, she said. The first letter of each word. Look, she wrote quickly on a sheet of paper. T to O. to C, CA, AC, CI, IE, EW, WA, AT, TO, OS, SA, AA, 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 AQ, QP, P. The inspector stared at it. And what does that spell? Miss Marple gave a wry smile. Nothing immediately, I agree, but read only the capitalized words. To Colonel Loscombe, for whom no dinner party is ever complete without a tale of scandal and a questionable punchline. Take the initials. T, C, L, N, D, P, E, T, S, Q, P. Dover squinted. Still gibberish. No, she said. Look again. Remove every second. Initial, and you're left with TLDETSP, now rearranged. She jotted the letters quickly and rearranged them again. TELEPTSD. Wait, no. Not all the initials are relevant. Only the first letters of the line. To Colonel Loscombe. The message is embedded only in that phrase, not the whole toast. The initials are TCLF, WN, D, PI, E, WA, TOSA. But it's not a cipher in the letters themselves, it's a code in the reference. She was referencing Colonel Loscombe's story. The question mark, punchline. Dover's brows drew together. So, the story had a double meaning? She was trying to use the toast as cover, Miss Marple said. A secret message in plain sight. A signal to whom? To me, Dover blinked again. Why not just tell you directly? She couldn't, Miss Marple said. Charlotte, or Cecily as we now know her, was already being watched. That man had embedded himself into the house. If she had been overheard telling me what she knew, she would never have left the room, alive. So instead, she delivered a toast. Harmless. Social. But pointed. She made a reference to the only man in the room who always told scandalous stories. The Colonel. Yes. And he'd told one just a week earlier, over tea, in the Rose Garden. Do you recall it? About the spy who smuggled secrets out of occupied France by encoding them in dinner menus? Dover's eyes widened slowly. She was trying to smuggle a message past her own murderer, Miss Marple said. But he misunderstood. He thought the toast was simply a gesture, a flourish from a frightened woman. He didn't know she was telling me. Watch him. He's here. Dover sat down heavily. So, the toast wasn't a toast. It was a warning, she said, and I missed it. At least, I missed it in time. Dover's face had gone pale. So she knew who the man was all along. The one pretending to be Norris. He wasn't just a stranger from her past. He was an agent of someone else. Or perhaps someone else entirely. Miss Marple's fingers moved over the note card. He knew everything about her, her secrets, her child, her betrayal of the original will. The question was, how? She stood and walked to the window. Rain had begun again, faint and rhythmic, like a ticking clock. She must have told someone, she said softly. Long ago. Someone she trusted. Perhaps a friend, perhaps a lover. But someone who disappeared and returned with a new name. She turned back to Dover. He wasn't just pretending to be Dr. Norris, he was pretending to be someone who had never left. Dover stood. So who was he? She opened her handbag again and took out a photograph, yellowed at the edges. This was found in Edward's coat pocket. It's of Cecily, aged perhaps 17. And standing next to her, this man, Dover stared. That's Gowans, the butler, Miss Marple nodded. But not quite. The man in the photo is Gowans' brother. Edward told me in a fevered moment, he's not who he says he is. Gowans had a brother, a twin, who vanished after a scandal involving forged signatures at a London estate office. The family quietly disavowed him. But Cecily, she knew him. Perhaps she even protected him. Dover sat again, rubbing his face. He posed as Gowans. Took his place. The real Gowans retired last year, didn't he? No one had seen him in the village for months. Miss Marple nodded. He died, quietly, in Wales. But his brother, George, knew everything about Greystone. He'd grown up on its fringes. When Charlotte reached out for help, she thought she was writing to her old butler. She never realized the man who returned was the one she'd once betrayed. Dover whispered, "So the man who served the wine was the man who had been serving revenge." Silence settled again. Then Dover stood, briskly. "I'll have the cellar searched, and the staff questioned. Again." He left the room. Miss Marple remained by the window, listening to the rain. She had solved the mystery, yes, but it did not feel like victory. Too many ghosts. Lingered behind the curtains, too many names carved into windowsills and spoken in toasts no one understood until too late. Then, faintly, from the hallway, she heard a voice. "Agnes." "There's something else," the girl said, breathless. I found something in the nursery, behind the toy chest. A note. From Charlotte, but not to Edward, to someone named Rose." Miss Marple turned slowly. "Rose," she whispered, "the one secret still buried." And with that she knew the story was not quite over.